Welcome to the Pacesetter Pod, where we explore and reveal the perspectives, insights, and approaches to deliver great results and growth in your agribusiness through better execution. Here's your host, the Integration Pacesetter, Joe Mosier.
Welcome, Pacesetters of Agribusiness, to another episode of the Pacesetter Pod, where we amplify voices from across the agricultural industry. We aggregate those perspectives and work to elevate our collective thinking around strategy execution. I'm your host, Joe Mosier, and as always, I appreciate you choosing to spend your time with us today. A very quick reminder to like and subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. You can do it right now. And if you're so inclined, we'd love it if you consider leaving us a review and let us know how we're doing. So for today's episode, I want to talk about talent and people. Talent and people in agribusiness are not just critical to staffing and running your operation. They're also increasingly how you differentiate on service, how you set yourself apart on insights, on demonstrating reliability of the product or service and delivering value to the customer, and also in the responsiveness to the emerging and changing nature of your customers' needs. As we all know, as we're all experiencing increasingly over time, and this is structural, not cyclical in my point of view, talent is a constrained resource in our industry. We have an aging and declining rural workforce in the populations where we operate. I would argue there's probably less interest in many cases of the operating conditions of some of the physical environments and the nature of the jobs and travel with the work that we do in agribusiness. There's that seasonal pressure of the business, which requires great sacrifice. And there's, sometimes less appetite to do that over time. And also, and I don't have, the data to support this, but just what I observe in the marketplace, comparatively more modest earning potential over the course of a career in agribusiness relative to some other career paths that folks can choose to follow. And all those things create a lot of that constraint on talent. Further, in addition to this, the underlying growth of your agribusiness changes people needs over time and further tightens that constraint and creates more tension. And sometimes the changes that growth requires within your business, it shows up in some subtle and not obvious ways that elude the attention of leadership. Now, I recognize that setting things up as a binary construct, ones and zeros, right and wrong, yes or no, it's a bit lazy intellectually, I'll admit that. But I think it's also helpful sometimes to use these constructs and getting ourselves to look inward and think critically about some specific slice or element of our business. Some examples that are arguably too general to give us any sort of precise answers as we do that introspection, they do nonetheless inspire some pretty good conversations. So think about some of the, if you went to business school or if you've read any sort of business literature and different business models and what has set companies up for success, we've all heard this thing of, do you want to be the low-cost provider or the value-added leader, right? Operating at two ends of the spectrum, but thinking in that kind of sort of dichotomy, two polar opposites, I think is helpful. Are we a low-cost provider or value-added leader? Do we want to be a one-stop shop for our farmer customers? Or do we want to be hyper-focused and best-in-class in providing a specific type of product or service to those same growers? Again, lots of room in between, but sometimes that those two extremes are helpful as a construct. There's even, with recent guests, we have, do you want to be a bulk feed, hyper-stable and predictable macronutrient pellet manufacturer? Or are you going to be in the custom blending, small batch, bespoke nutrition providing business? And in most instances, if you look at these kinds of different dichotomies or different extremes on a spectrum, you find yourself leaning one way or the other. Rarely is someone uniquely only at one end of the spectrum. And so it's not the answer so much as the question and the self-reflection and the consideration that it ignites that is the value. And so getting back to my point, when it comes to growth in agribusiness, and as that business grows, all the tensions that emerge around people, around the way that you organize your people, the way you staff your business, the way you manage your talent, the way you develop your future leaders, there's a shift that often goes unnoticed and creates some real issues that don't immediately reveal themselves, certainly don't reveal themselves as being related. And that's a tension around the question of, do we want to be generalists or specialists? And that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. Now, before we get into the generalist versus specialist debate and breaking that down, directly, let's set the stage. What do I mean when it comes to the people processes I just alluded to? What do I mean by attention in people processes and systems? What I'm referring to is akin to your very standard and predictable things that you do around your people every day. The ways by which you find talent. How do you train and ready new hires so that they can perform well in their jobs? How do you engage and keep your people? How do you compensate and reward them? What's the structures around the way you do that? How do you develop your people really to the outer limits of their potential in alignment with the future needs of the business? Right? How do you go about doing that? And how do you develop and manage bench strength in a way that does all of the above, but is also aligned to the long-term succession planning needs of your organization? As you grow, and this generalist versus specialist gauge might shift over time, and we're going to get into that specifically. But as you grow, the ways you do all that kind of work change, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worst. Sometimes they don't change at all. They just become issues at scale. So for a few examples here, some of the things that might remain similar in terms of how you do the work, they just scale, is onboarding and training new people and giving them the tools to perform. You might not fundamentally change your onboarding and orientation process. It just becomes a lot more complex as it becomes a volume game, as you get multiple assets, bigger locations, more requirements for talent to run those facilities. It just becomes a bigger challenge, but it's similar in nature to when it was 5 people a quarter and now it's 50 people per quarter. Some of these processes might get some favorable impacts from growth. Think about as your business grows and expands, it likely, in many cases, will create a more complex organization, which that's a whole different topic we could talk about. But as an organization becomes more complex as it grows, one of the positive byproducts is that it creates a new basket of professional opportunities that are different perhaps from what the smaller company vintage provided, the one that you just outgrew. So when you think about how do you offer you interesting opportunities for people to grow themselves in their career, how do you help people paint a picture for themselves for 10, 15, 20 years in the organization where there's multiple different things that they could do and multiple levels of accountability and responsibility they could grow into? You will, by virtue of growth, likely have a greater number of positions with different types of work, potentially more layers, and more levels of authority and accountability that goes with it. And so while none of us should ever be excited about creating new layers in the business, when it's done thoughtfully in response to growth, it can be a good problem to have because it can offer some solutions to some other people challenges you might have had. And so that's an example of where they might be favorably impacted by growth. And of course, there's some people challenges that are not positively impacted by growth. And in fact, the underlying challenge just becomes amplified. I'm thinking about sustaining your culture. If you struggle to sustain your culture growing from 20 to 30, going from 30 to 100 or 100 to 500 just becomes a magnitude more difficult. The ways you develop your people can become more difficult in the context of having less intimate relationships. There's more moving parts in the business. And of course, compensation is going to become more challenging too, both in the sense that the payroll gets a lot bigger, and that's a demand on management to deliver value in excess of the cost to create it. But with size comes a tendency to democratize compensation and hide rewards behind things like job bands and do less customized recognition to key talent in the form of compensation, just as the organization grows. So the whole point being here that this generalist versus specialist tension is there. We're going to talk about that next. Growth highlights where that might be a problem, and it shows up in a multiple different supporting processes, enabling processes around your people. And that's really why I think this is really important and sometimes doesn't show up immediately on people's radar, as this might be an underlying question we need to spend some time chewing on and thinking through, because it's manifest as pain and friction in a variety of other processes in the business. So if we've covered now some of the underappreciated people challenges of growth, let's talk about why this happens. What does generalists versus specialists have to do with it? If you go back to a business's earliest days, those kind of poetic and romantically and nostalgically recalled days when it was just a scrappy startup of a couple people in a garage or whatever the inception story is for the business. When you start out, and almost certainly when you start out the default setting, in your organization is generalist. Everyone kind of does everything. Everyone is leaned upon to help out every day with the new opportunity, often disguised as a crisis of the day. As new processes are stood up, if you actually want to call them processes, there are things where everyone can jump in and do it, right? Whether it's we need to record incoming sales orders, we need to do an inventory movement in our tracking system, we need to ensure that these products can be released for sale because we verified their quality status, order fulfillment generally, handling payables, dealing with receivables issues, even for God's sakes, who's going to go in and reset the server because we have on-prem server and it's down again. It's just the nature of the business. You don't have the luxury of prescriptively defined and vigilantly held boundaries of your job. That's not the nature of it. You're there to create something and grow something. And so everyone kind of does everything. Now let's go from that and let's jump past the multi-year or multi-decade growth process and go all the way to the other end. So where smaller companies are often staffed with generalists, larger and more formalized, let's say, agribusinesses, they tend almost in all cases towards more specialization, whether they like it or not. And first it happens by function. Where we used to kind of do everything, now we have someone who's in charge of sales. Now we have someone who's going to oversee warehousing and operations and production. This is our accounting person, right? It starts at a high level. So just kind of a general segmentation. And then it becomes more granular over time. As the growth continues, that specialization amplifies. It gets a momentum. And I'm not saying this is bad, but it's something we need to think about because I think we jump past it and take it as assumed knowledge. And we should be thinking about why this happens and what those implications are. What used to be everyone did sales, and then now one person is kind of our sales guy or gal. Now what used to be sales is broken down into we've got sales planning, we've got someone who leads the sales management process, we've got someone who's leading inside sales, someone who's doing outside sales, someone who does customer success after the orders have been submitted. What used to be accounting suddenly splits into we have a payables person and someone who does receivables, and that's the credit team. And here's the person in charge of the control environment. There's who's handling treasury, and we also have this audit tag, either internal or a representative to the external auditing firm. These things happen, and so why does this matter, right, Joe? Like, why are you spending time talking about this? Enough with the preamble. Why does it matter?
Poorly executed mergers and acquisitions destroy more value than they create. They can set your company back years. To defend your firm's position in the marketplace, you need access to the leading practices that unlock the greater potential of your people, processes, and systems. If you are undertaking a company transformation or pursuing an acquisition as a vehicle to grow, set up a call with Joe by visiting www.moshercg.com.
It matters because based on what I observe in my work and what I suspect more than a few of you listening are in the throes of dealing with right now, is when you move from a business that has been staffed with a team of generalists, there are limits to what it can reliably and sustainably do. And it may not always be clear when that shift into specialization has happened. And maybe a lot of those processes that you used to rely on for a generalist organization are now trying to be retrofit onto a specialist organization that's not working. Or where maybe you need to move into more specialist type roles in certain aspects of your business, but you haven't done it yet because it violates that cultural tenet of, no, we're a business where everyone does everything. And so I bring this up because I think it's an unspoken set of extremes in the organization that we're not really spending enough time talking about, thinking about, and acknowledging as having some real impact and import into how successful we can grow over time. And I think that's reasonable, right? It's reasonable that we're missing this. That's the purpose of this podcast, is to share some ideas that might get us thinking differently. When you remember the early days of a business, those early days when there was no marketing department. Why? Because everyone was the marketing department. When you've come from that environment, or maybe you were there with the first time there was one person that got tagged as the marketing lead. He or she did other things too, but marketing was also something that they were now explicitly accountable for. When you've come from that, it's really uncomfortable to start to think about specialization. What do you mean we want someone that just does digital marketing and that we're going to have someone else whose job is to manage events and promotions? And we're going to have someone else that's just in charge of print media and advertising? And did I just hear somebody say we're going to hire a social media manager? I mean, I've spent the last 10 to 15 years trying to get my people not to sit on Facebook while they're at work. And now we want to pay someone to be a full-time Facebook poster? It's a big shift. And it happens very slowly. And then it happens all of a sudden. And again, I'm raising this with all of you because I have seen in our client organizations how that same question, asked at the right level at the right time, that same question of generalist versus specialist. Who are we? What do we want to be? What does our strategy require? That question really inspires some rich dialogue and forward thinking. If you want to honor the tradition of a team of generalists, if that is a really important aspect of what a leadership team and ownership wants from an organization, you have to recognize that you're probably agreeing to some very probable and predictable constraints on growth. And conversely, if you as a group decide you want to go whole hog on specialization, man, we can't keep doing this. We can't have everyone doing everything. It's not clear what the status of everything is. And we're doing things differently because we're all trained differently. We want to go in, we're going to be a specialist organization. You have to understand that you're agreeing to underwrite some significant changes in the type of roles the organization has, the profile of people to fill those roles, some big changes to how the work will get done, and maybe some changes in the overall compensation load for the organization, both for the better or the worse. And there's no right or wrong answer here, but not asking the question is certainly the wrong tactic because you're not going to get clear as a leadership team, and then it's going to be suboptimal. So this is a sticky issue, and it's not going to resolve itself. Frankly, it'll simply become entrenched as a tension of misalignment as management and departments and individuals. Everyone comes in to do their best work every day. And if there's some signals of where we need to be a generalist organization and some roles require a specialist, or the way we interact with customers and suppliers, if it's not clear, you're basically going to struggle to keep things moving. And without that clarity, your customers and your results will pay a price. And again, it'll be hidden. It'll be small little injuries along the way, 1,000 cuts. So while I admit that it's not going to be in visible ways every day, it will accumulate meaningfully over time. Okay, so what can we do about this? What can we do about this generalist versus specialist construct? Honestly, the best thing that you can do is to just start talking about it. You're listening to me talk about it today. Maybe it's inspiring you with some, I wonder what this needs to look like in the future in this department. I wonder what my leadership team would say. I wonder what my people would say. Do they see this tension? Has anyone else used these words or thought about this? Just asking the questions is the best first thing you can do. And this is important. You ask the questions not with the intent or the expectation of immediately deciding and solving for it, but for just getting it on the table, for getting some input, and for starting to think about where a lack of clarity across this spectrum could be causing problems now, and even more importantly, where it may show up as causing problems next. Look at what your customers need and just work back from there, right? Time-honored advice. What's the kind of service that they expect? What are the kinds of skills that sort of service would require? When we consider that service and those skills, what kind of role does that imply in terms of a position or role in the company? What kind of structure would we need around that role to enable it to be successful? And what are the kinds of people processes that would underpin all of this to build and improve and sustain that structure of people going out and meeting the needs of the market and meeting the needs of our customers? You start to think about that, I guarantee you're going to find areas of opportunity. But here's something else to keep in mind as you dig into this. If this is inspiring you and you're ready to go and you think, oh, wow, this is actually something we should have asked ourselves a long time ago. If this is actually moving to you, the other thing you need to know is that for the sake of simplicity, and admittedly, maybe to be a bit provocative or antagonistic today, I set this up as an either or. It's binary, right? You're a generalist organization where everyone does everything, or you're a specialist organization where people do one set of things incredibly well. The reality is almost certainly not like that in your company. You probably, depending on the person, the department, the season of the business, or even the nature of the issue being dealt with, you probably operate along a spectrum, right? So something that can be very helpful is to start thinking about where in your business operations and where in your customer market interactions would having someone acting in a generalist capacity be desirable, right? Where would that be actually additive? And where is it much more impactful, much more efficient, much more value creating to have somebody operating as a specialist, right? So think about this targeted specialization, to use that example, has a number of benefits. You can, if you're targeted in saying these particular roles are going to be specialized, it shows that you're reacting in real time to specific needs of the customer, right? You're saying this is exactly what the customer needs, and we're going to build our staffing strategy around it. Targeted specialization is also a modest change in the expense load, right? You're not changing the nature of the entire organization. You're changing a couple of very critical roles. And so that expense load in terms of compensation is going to be small relative to a complete organizational overhaul. From a culture perspective, it's also a more gradual change to the way that work gets done. And if you have an overarching generalist culture, an overall generalist culture will try to reject specialist work like a new organ. It will happen. But if you do it in small ways, you do it and you're thoughtful about it and how it's introduced and managed, and you've communicated well, it's a beautiful opportunity to experiment and to see how it works. You can reverse course if needed, or learn, adapt, and expand as necessary. Now, I know that many of you might be saying, we already have a good degree of specialization in our functions, Joe. We've already moved past this. We never asked that question, maybe. When I look at my company, say we're highly specialized, this is not attention, that's great. I am really, really happy for you. And you probably have a whole host of other challenges you can be getting onto. I don't mean to waste your time, but I do think that you should probably still take a look, because I don't think that the fact that you think you've moved past it makes you immune from the opportunity to improve. So just thinking, how could some minimum standards of generalists, of generalist background, how might that help you build bench strength for future leaders? When you think about the top of the house and you need to backfill these roles, these are people who are going to have to look across functions, reach down into different parts of the business for information, for input, for engagement. Where might some kind of minimum standards for generalists be important? So you might have a hyper-specialized company, but at some level, people can't only know one thing when they're leading the whole thing. Where could 1 to 2 experimental bets on hyper-specialized roles, if you are a more generalist organization, where could 1 or 2 bets help advance a strategic initiative? We've all had things that have failed to get traction that are nonetheless really, really important to our strategy and the future success of the company. And maybe if you look at it, you say, well, we favored familiarity with our business over actually getting the expertise to solve that specific problem. Maybe we need somebody who's just really focused and specialized in this particular area to lead it, and they can show us what we don't know. So I think the opportunities are there no matter where you are in the spectrum of specialist to generalist as an operating approach, and no matter where you are in terms of how well you believe things are working or not working. This is an area to spend some time on. And so this is what I mean. Just take the temperature with senior management in your one-on-ones. Maybe discuss it with your CHRO or your people leader in the business or co-op and ask them what they think. Are you a generalist organization or a specialist? Is this manifest as a tension when we think about this? Do some of our legacy processes kind of generally train and equip people as if they're going to be generalists, only then to drop them into specialist roles? Do our systems and processes around how they do the work require them to be generalists to navigate the system, but we incent them based on being specialists? Like, where is there some daylight? Think about, putting this on a leadership team's offsite agenda, just simply for exploration and discussion. Think about the kind of work that needs to be done to deliver on your strategy. If there's any daylight between the work that needs to get done and the way that you're currently organized to do that work. Invest a little bit of time in looking into this. And then I'd love to hear what interesting examples of high alignment or extreme misalignment revealed themselves. I'd love to hear about it and hear what your experience was. So thank you, as always, for listening to the program and for listening to today's episode. I never take the time you spend listening to the podcast for granted, and I hope it was of value to you. If it was, please share this with others who you feel will find similar benefit. And as I said at the top of the show, we'd love it if you'd leave a review and let us know how we're doing. I deeply appreciate you being part of the Pacesetter Pod community and admire the fact that you take the time to listen and consider and sometimes even action different ways to improve strategy execution, all in support of growing your agribusiness. Thank you as always, and we'll see you here next time.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.